Hi everyone, Michael Smith here. If you've seen any of my previous videos or read my book, Base 12 Numerology, right away you'll recognize this elegant wing-shaped image. This is the pattern the prime numbers make when expressed as a vibrational cycle in Base 12. It's what led me to adapt traditional Base 10 numerology to Base 12 and continues to inspire me in exploring just how far it may reach. My other videos focused on specific areas where the base 12 cycle and this vibrational pattern seem to arise. Areas such as numerology, the golden ratio, DNA, and even in a novel reinterpretation of pi, the defining ratio of a circle. But in this video, we're going to zoom way out, as far as we can conceptually can, to the most fundamental nature of reality itself. We will consider the simplest possible way of creating something from nothing, using only the most basic of geometric ideas and mathematical principles. What we discover is that it's the base 12 prime vibration that emerges as the creative structure of reality. But what we also realize is that the infinity-shaped dynamic of the prime waveform seems to define consciousness too, of a singular point of perspective gaining self-awareness through creative expressions of itself. And, most profoundly, that at the heart of it all is the vibrational geometry of harmony and love. Suddenly we have a radically new and fundamental way of looking at reality, a reality that emerges as the geometry of love understanding itself. So this really is a love story, perhaps the ultimate love story, and one written in the universal language of vibration. This beautiful idea of love being the essence and purpose of it all resonates on so many levels, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And it's a simple message of unity and harmony we could really use, especially now in a world so shaken and divided by a pandemic. When we think of reality, we typically picture everything we can physically see or touch, but not so much its non-physical aspects, the fields and forces and laws of nature working behind the scenes that science has nevertheless proven to exist. Still, thanks to the likes of Einstein and other explorers of reality, we know that everything we perceive as solid is anything but. Reality is a continuous dance between energy and matter, where even space and time are not as fundamental or fixed as they seem, but rather emergent phenomena relative to some observer, to some conscious point of view. So when we consider reality in the most fundamental terms, what is it ultimately relative to? In other words, what is the simplest way to describe a point of perspective? This brings us to the start of our story, and quite literally the point of it all. A point is the simplest geometric expression of existence, of something rather than nothing. Having zero dimensions, its only property is as a neutral point of reference, an origin from which more can be expressed and related back to. Thus, the point must be the first creative concept to emerge in any model of reality. Next, the simplest expression of a zero-dimensional point is a one-dimensional line, essentially a point seeking to explore beyond itself. However, as a line travels in a single direction from its point of origin, it doesn't preserve that origin as a neutral reference point, but rather sticks it on one end, so to speak. This preservation of geometric neutrality, I suggest, is an essential property of reality in order to remain true to its original neutral state. So, despite the localized contrast and polarity we encounter in physical reality, neutrality must be maintained overall. We see plenty of evidence of this energetic balancing act in nature, in the way oppositely charged particles combine to form neutral atoms, the way magnetism has opposite poles, and how matter and antimatter emerge from nothing and annihilate back to nothing. The simplest shape which does maintain neutrality overall is a circle centered about the origin. Basically the two-dimensional plane created by a line expressing itself outward in all possible directions. This brings us to another inherent property of reality, that all possibilities or probabilities are available. If they weren't, reality would be inherently incomplete, a contradiction to the very notion of being whole. And just as a line represents the linear motion of a point, a circle represents the radial rotation of a line spinning around that point. In other words, a cycle. The simplest type of circle is the unit circle with a radius of 1 unit in length. and as mathematics has come to appreciate, this is the fundamental construct of complex numbers through which physics is most naturally described. The imaginary and real coordinates which define the complex numbers ensure the geometric neutrality that reality requires. In fact, the rotational nature of complex numbers is such an important concept, of each 90-degree rotation equivalent to multiplying by I, the imaginary number I, that this enables us to make that conceptual leap from numbers as only existing on a one-dimensional physical number line to a two-dimensional cycle of probabilities which rotate through that line. And where the boundary of that cycle passes through the number line is where real numbers manifest with 100% certainty. So, the next step in building our model of reality is to characterize the rotational increments which most simply describe the circle as a cycle. In traditional base 10 or decimal system, that means a circle divided like a pie into 10 equal sectors by 10 equally spaced positions around its perimeter. And the simplest way to quantify those 10 positions is with the whole numbers from 0 to 9. So where these numbers represent the first cycle of integers, all other integers are generated by subsequent cycles of those same 10 positions. However, the choice of base 10 for mathematics is actually an arbitrary one, and not a very efficient one at that. This is because the base 10 cycle can only be divided or factored in two additional ways, by 2 or 5, that is, in half or in fifths. The base 12 cycle, on the other hand, is much more versatile with 4 ways of dividing itself, by 2, 3, 4, or 6. In other words, more ways of expressing the whole in terms of its parts. That said, there's many other number systems out there, such as the base 2 or binary system used in computers, being the simplest, though least factorable, only being divisible in half. Or say the base 60 or sexagesimal system used by ancient Sumerians and that we still use today to measure things such as time, angles, and geographic coordinates. Though highly factorable, base 60 is also very cumbersome. So, at the end of the day, base 12 seems to offer the best compromise between versatility and simplicity and would be the more logical choice for reality. And yes, I just used the word choice, as if suggesting this geometric transition from point to line to circle and cycle is somehow conscious. Hold that thought for now, and we'll get back to it shortly. Now, based on our reasoning so far, the base 12 cycle of integers from 0 to 11 would seem to be a pretty fundamental way of generating all possible integers. But there's actually an even simpler and more efficient way to express that cycle. And that's through the prime numbers, integers greater than 1 that can only be divided by 1 or themselves, such as 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, and so on. This is because every possible integer is either a prime itself, like 7, or is the product of 2 or more primes multiplied together, such as 35 as the product of 5 times 7. This is why prime numbers are considered the fundamental building blocks of mathematics. This suggests that only those positions around the base 12 cycle at which prime numbers can occur is all that's really needed to fully describe all 12 positions, and thus all possible integers. As it turns out, there are only 4 such prime positions in base 12, positions 1, 5, 7, and 11. This is because at the other 8 positions, only non-primes can occur, or the prime factors of 12 itself, the numbers 2 and 3. For example, position 4 is non-prime, since it equals 2 times 2. 6 is non-prime, being 2 times 3. 8 non-prime as 2 times 2 times 2. 9 as 3 times 3. 10 is 2 times 5. And finally, position 0 is non-prime because only multiples of 12 can occur there, 12 being 2 times 2 times 3. That leaves us with only prime positions 1, 5, 7, and 11 of the base 12 cycle as the fundamental cycle of our conceptual model of reality. Interestingly, despite the traditional definition of prime numbers as excluding the number 1, we see here that position 1 is actually one of the 4 positions critical to the primes when viewed in base 12 in this cyclical way. Likewise, prime numbers only occur at positions 2 and 3 in that first cycle of 12, but not beyond that. As such, 2 and 3 can be considered the structural framework per se, of the base 12 cycle itself, and upon which all other prime numbers are built. Also, note that some numbers occurring at those prime positions will become non-prime exceptions if they also happen to be the product of two or more smaller primes. The number 25 is the first such case. Although occurring at prime position 1, that is 2 cycles of 12 above 1, it is also the product of 5 times 5. In vibrational terms, 25 is called a harmonic or frequency multiple of the prime number 5, and therefore not a unique prime itself. These frequency harmonics explain the intermittent gaps which appear in the series of prime numbers, gaps which tend to get larger as we proceed up the number scale because there's more and more smaller primes as potential harmonic factors. Nevertheless, the prime waveform dictates that at positions 1, 5, 7, and 11, only primes or non-prime harmonics can occur. That said, there's a further simplification to the base 12 cycle that reality could make, reducing the 4 prime positions down to 2. This is because the rectangular relationship between those 4 positions on the base 12 circle puts the 7 and 1 positions opposite each other, and likewise the 11 and 5 positions opposite. And because each prime position represents the magnitude of its number, it can be treated as a vector of that length pointing away from the origin. As such, the opposite vectors of each pair combine into a single vector equal to their difference, both in terms of length and direction. That is, the 7 and 1 vectors subtract to a vector of length 6 and pointing towards 7 as the longer of the two vectors, while 11 and 5 also subtract to a vector of length 6, this time pointing towards position 11. This enables us to simplify the base 12 prime cycle as having 2 prime positions only, at 7 and 11, both of which have a vector length of 6, which is essentially a base 12 cycle of radius 6. So now let's consider how reality would most simply express that base 12 prime cycle. As each stage in the geometric progression inherently involves a step into higher dimensionality, from a 0-dimensional point to a 1-dimensional line to a 2-dimensional cycle, the next step would be the simplest 3D expression of a cycle, which is a vibration. Now, although we might be tempted to say that a sphere would be the more appropriate 3D expression of a cycle than a vibration, the flipping of a cycle end over end to create a sphere fails to express the rotational nature of the cycle that came before. That sort of inefficiency wouldn't make sense for the simplest expression of reality, so that's why I think a vibration would come next. And if we had to pick one property of nature that best describes everything we see, vibrational would be it. Practically everything is vibrational, from the subatomic particles and fundamental forces of nature, to atoms, molecules, and cells, to sound waves, ocean waves, and brain waves. So when these 2 prime positions at 7 and 11 are expressed as a vibration for a base 12 cycle of radius 6, a double helix pattern emerges which still fully describes the vibrational nature of all 4 prime positions. Note that had we not simplified the 4 prime positions down to 2, the resulting vibration would have been a complicated mess of 4 overlapping, ever-growing spirals, not a clean double spiral pattern of constant amplitude 6. Still, a vibration such as this, traveling in one direction only, suffers from the same lack of neutrality as did its earlier form as a line projected from a point, its point origin being off to one side. The only vibrational expression which does retain its neutrality and central origin is a standing wave. This would be the vibration created if the base 12 prime cycle were confined to a width of one wavelength only, with position 6 as its origin. Each cycle would oscillate back and forth through that same central intersection point at position 6. And since each vibrational cycle becomes superimposed upon every other cycle, it would appear as a single cycle just standing still, and thus the name. This is the same type of standing wave produced by any stringed musical instrument, like a violin. Because each string is fixed at both ends, its vibrations bounce back and forth as a closed standing wave pattern for any given note. However, unlike a violin string, which produces a nice symmetric figure-8 pattern relative to the string's neutral state when motionless, The prime waveform is a little distorted, as we can see. It's slightly asymmetric with its two ends, positions 0 and 12, elevated above the neutral real number line, while its middle position, position 6, falls below. This lopsided shape is simply due to the lopsided positions on the base 12 cycle of the 2 points that generated it, again at 7 and 11. Now, because the standing wave fixes the position of the prime vibration relative to position 6, the 12 orientations of the base 12 cycle of positions 7 and 11 essentially behave as 12 rotations of those 2 points on the 3D surface of a sphere. So, the standing wave as a fixed vibration in 3D space is equivalent to rotations of a 3D sphere about the real number line. And as with a standing wave, a sphere centered about the origin is still geometrically neutral. But in order for those spherical rotations to describe probabilities in 3D, they need to operate in 3 imaginary dimensions. And once again, complex numbers come to the rescue. As with rotations of a unit circle, it's through complex numbers that spherical rotations are most fundamentally described. But instead of requiring just one imaginary axis plus the real number line, as with simple circular rotation, spherical rotation requires 3 imaginary axes plus the real number line. These 4D complex numbers that describe 3D rotations are called unit quaternions and feature prominently in modern physics, such as in characterizing the spin of particles in quantum mechanics or in formulating the equations of general relativity. So let's take a moment to understand our double helix prime waveform as a probability waveform of reality. First, the horizontal axis defines the real number line of the base 12 cycle. This is the neutral reality axis along which the 12 quantum positions occur as a sequential cycle and on which fundamental particles of matter can manifest. Likewise, the vertical axis defines the probability amplitude of each of those 12 positions. The greater a position's amplitude above or below the neutral reality axis, the less likely it will manifest. So, wherever the prime waveform intersects the reality axis is where physical matter, or antimatter, naturally occurs. That is, at prime positions 1, 5, 7, and 11. This could explain why only 12 subatomic matter particles, or fermions, have been found, and 12 antimatter particles predicted. Why only 4 of those particles bind together in making the nuclei of all atoms, those being the up and down quarks and their antiparticles, which would be at positions 1, 5, 7, and 11, and why another 2 particles manifest but remain unbounded to the other 4, the electron and positron, at positions 0 and 12. Also, position 6 as the neutral origin and ground state of the prime waveform, and the zero spin polarity reversal from which all matter particles obtain their probabilities. This seems to describe the ground state of the Higgs field remarkably well too. Still, just from a visual point of view, the prime vibration is undeniably beautiful. Elegantly simple and deeply symbolic, it resembles a butterfly emerging, a bird in flight, the ancient symbol for infinity, and even the double helix structure of DNA, the blueprint of life itself. And just as compelling, the form this figure-8 pattern would take over all possible cycles of itself would be a 3D torus, the signature donut shape of atoms, red blood cells, magnetic fields, and spiral galaxies. Note too how the geometry of position 6 dipping below the real axis creates a probability gap between positions 5 and 7 where nothing can manifest, what would appear as a circular void or a black hole in 3D, another mystery of nature that's been longing for an explanation. And if indeed the prime vibration were the underlying blueprint of reality, it would make sense that its 3D torus would manifest at many fractals of scale, such as these. Fractals, by the way, which all seem to emerge at the same resolution or particle density of 100 billion. For example, there are that many atoms in a DNA molecule, and roughly that many red blood cells in a newborn infant, neurons in the human brain, stars in a mature galaxy, and galaxies in the observable universe. As 100 billion is 10 to the power of 11, basically a complete cycle of base 12 cycles, and what a complete quaternion base 12 cycle would mathematically represent, this may be why. This brings us to another natural phenomenon that seems to match the base 12 prime pattern remarkably well, and that's consciousness. If we were to describe consciousness in the simplest terms possible, it would be that of a singular point of perspective gaining self-awareness through creative expressions of itself. Doesn't that perfectly describe the geometry of the prime vibration, of position 6 exploring itself through figure-8 cycles of polarized experience, not unlike the left-right polarized structure and function of the human brain? Note too how the black hole concealing position 6, like our inner sense of self, dips below the reality axis and feels hidden within. So, if reality were indeed consciousness in action, then that means everything emerges from consciousness and must have conscious awareness to some degree. Still, in the somewhat obscure title of this video, I suggest that reality is the geometry of love understanding itself. But so far I've just been discussing numbers, cycles, vibrations, and the geometry of consciousness in a very general and conceptual way. Nothing about love. What I haven't yet explained is how every position within the base 12 cycle also has specific vibrational qualities corresponding to its geometry within the double helix waveform. This includes its magnitude, or projected height between the upper and lower waves, its polarity, it's the relative proportion above or below the neutral reality axis, its rotational spin relative to an observer, which would be up, down, towards, or away, and its lateral direction, either forward if on the prime wave, solid prime wave, or backward if on the dashed wave. These four characteristics define the geometric profile or vibrational theme with which each of the 12 quantum positions resonates, and which anything manifested would presumably retain. So together, these 12 themes constitute a complete cycle of experience. And as we'll see next, the vibrational theme of position 6 from which the prime pattern emerges, and through which its awareness expands, is that of unity and love. But before we walk through the 12 vibrational themes, there's a further enhancement we can add to the prime waveform to help clarify how each theme flows into the next. This is the single wave produced when the two prime waves are added together, essentially their net effect when combined vibrationally. This is shown here in red. This reveals the vibration with which each position naturally resonates when the overall prime vibration is freely expressed, what I refer to as the path of resonance. So any position or positions out of alignment with this path for any given cycle will distort that cycle to some degree and alter its experience of love. Still, to fully know any vibration is to experience its full range of potential. Thus, for love to fully know itself, it must experience the full vibrational gamut from what love is to what love is not. As such, every unique expression of the prime waveform, however discordant or dysfunctional it may seem, enhances the self-awareness of love, an eternal process of love knowing itself more deeply. And although the prime vibration actually originates from beneath position 6 and extends out to position 0 and 12 before returning back to 6, we as physical observers would only perceive that portion which passes through physicality. That is, the unshaded regions of positive probability, being the upper left and lower right quadrants. This is why we perceive time as moving forward only. Our experience is limited to the left to right flow of the solid prime wave starting at position 0 and ending at position 12. So, we begin the cycle with position 0. As its geometry is that of a point above the real axis and with a spin fully away, it resonates as a purely unmanifest and distant potential. As that point actually represents the ending potential of the previous cycle, the dashed prime wave, and the starting potential of the new cycle, the solid wave, the more positively we end each cycle and begin the next determines our overall starting potential, being the red wave. And as the path of greatest resonance with love places the start of the red wave at its maximum height, To resonate with love means beginning each new experience with maximum optimism and enthusiasm. Next, we experience the geometry of position 1, that of positive polarity only, above the real axis, and our first point of contact with the real axis. This is the singular geometry of new beginnings, initiative, and independence. Its spin now slightly downward, position 1 begins to gain momentum and feel tangible. As this places the path of resonance, being the red wave, directly on the upper prime wave, it's with initiative and self-confidence that we should begin any new experience in order to resonate with love. At position 2, the geometry changes from a singular polarity to one of duality, of a 2-to-1 ratio of twice the positive polarity above the real axis than negative polarity below. Its spin more downward now, position 2 feels even more engaged and committed. The path of resonance, now falling halfway above the real axis, calls for a more positive bias towards cooperation than to its negative polarity of separation and competition. In other words, relating to contrast in a cooperative way is the most loving response. From the biased polarity of position 2, we now experienced the balanced polarity of position 3. This calls for an equal mix of asserting creative influence on that which you can control while allowing that which you cannot, maintaining neutrality overall. This is the neutral geometry of the catalyst, that which causes change without changing itself. Its spin, now fully downward, it is here at position 3 that the weight of reality is most keenly felt and potentials most powerfully made into reality. The overall range of potential at its greatest anywhere in the cycle, position 3 offers the greatest possibilities for creativity and diversity. Also, the path of resonance, falling directly on the neutral reality axis, means that is through a neutral and grounded balance between self-expression and going with the flow that most resonates with love. So from the highly polarized and influential geometry of position 3, we move next to the more stable and settled geometry of position 4, that of structure. Here, the geometry becomes biased and polarized once again, similar to position 2. But, unlike 2, which called for a greater positive assertion of its theme, position 4 calls for the opposite, of allowing less structure and more flexibility, the path of resonance falling halfway below the real axis. This suggests that a greater bias towards simplicity and improvisation, while maintaining enough order to feel safe, is the most loving response. Also, its spin, now beginning to move towards us, helps lessen the steep downward trajectory of the path of resonance, imparting a reassuring sense of control as we allow more unpredictability. The adaptive bias of position 4 now prepares us for the polarized geometry of position 5, the transformative theme of change. Where position 1 was our initial engagement with the real axis, position 5 marks our stepping off point into the unknown where love resides. The angle of spin even more towards us now, we feel the momentum of personal change upon us. The path of resonance also falling directly on the lower prime wave, it is through trust and courage that love comes within reach. This now brings us to position 6, the very heart of the base 12 prime vibration. The merging of opposite polarities into a singular and timeless point of reference, it represents the very geometry of love and of consciousness gaining self-awareness through contrast. Like position 0, at which potential is maximized through both the assertion and allowance of what is possible, it is through the giving and receiving of love that this potential is most fully realized at 6. The spin, now directed completely towards us, and the downward trajectory of the path of resonance now halted, position 6 resonates with a profound sense of connection and unity. Love is the ground state and intention of all that is, and the turning point from the physical heaviness of positions 1 through 5 to the lighter spiritual enlightenment of positions 7 through 11. The enlightened counterpart of positions 1 geometry, of a physical new beginning, brings us to position 7, which resonates with a new beginning of truth. With its forward spin now turning upward, we feel pulled towards higher learning and of sharing truth with others in loving ways. It is this sense of purpose and belief that empowers us to apply our truth in constructive ways, the manifestation theme of position 8. The enlightened counterpart of position 2, of creating balance through physical contrast, position 8 resonates with creating physical spiritual abundance. Its even more elevated spin gives a sense of capability and self-worth that we can achieve anything when inspired by love. This brings us to the equally polarized geometry of position 9, of completion. The enlightened counterpart of position 3, of physical influence and response in neutral balance, position 9 resonates with celebrating achievement while accepting endings beyond our control, of objective neutrality. Its spin fully upward, position 9 acknowledges every outcome with loving gratitude and contentment. The neutral fulfillment of position 9 enables the contemplative awareness of position 10. As the enlightened counterpart of position 4, of physical flexibility and open structure, position 10 resonates with perceptual flexibility and open-mindedness. So, instead of relaxing merely physical constraints, position 10 calls for relaxing any perceptual biases obscuring love. Its upward spin, starting to retreat away now, enhances our sense of selflessness for the greater good. Finally, the selfless clarity of position 10 enables us to see the illumination of position 11. The enlightened counterpart of position 5, of physical change, position 11 resonates with a change of perspective. Its positive spin, almost fully retreating away, enables the greater truth to be seen beyond ourselves as we transition to position 12. The base 12 cycle of experience now vibrationally complete, we return home to love at position 6 with greater awareness, and then back to position 0 to explore a new cycle of potential, ever more enlightened and wise. Basically, perpetual cycles of love expanding itself. It was really such a profound realization for me that these 12 quantum geometries align with a number of themes of ancient numerology. This was the evidence that convinced me not only that numerology is a real science and should actually be base 12, not base 10, but also that reality and perhaps consciousness itself emerge from the same prime vibration that give numbers their meaning and enables mathematics to describe nature so well. Most importantly, the prime vibration suggests that love may indeed be at the heart of it all, a perfect ending to a universal love story. Thanks for watching.